Hello, my name is Eddie Youssef. I am the host and the speaker of the show, The Truth and Lies. And on today's topic, we're going to talk about the real face of Islam. But before we do that, we would like whoever's watching to share this video, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook. Please subscribe to our channel, that is at trinitychannel.com. And please comment, like, object, tell us anything that you have to say about this topic during the show. Our phone number here is 248-416-1300. The phone lines were open in approximately 20 minutes. So again, this topic for today is the real face of Islam. That's what we'll be talking about. But joining us via Skype is Dr. David Cashin. Now, Dr. David Cashin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and to the audience that are watching?
To chat with you this afternoon. I'm a teacher at Columbia International University in Columbia, South Carolina, where I've been for about the last 19 years. I served as a missionary in Bangladesh for 9 years and in Europe for another 6. But I've had a heart and passion for Muslim friends around the world, worked with Muslims in Southern California and other locations as well. And that's been really my heartbeat ever since I met the Lord back in 1971. I was living in the Middle East for a time there in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, and met the Lord Jesus. And when he brought me to himself, he made it clear very early on, I want you to be telling Muslims the good news of Jesus. And that's really been the focus of my life for the last 45 years.
Well, we definitely appreciate that. That's quite a long time to be in the Lord as well. And we know we have some ups and downs in the Lord as well. So just like any faith movement, there will be ups and downs. For such a long time that you've been doing this for, obviously, Dr. David, you've dealt with a lot of Muslims, I would say, perhaps. And what we're seeing today, specifically in the news, like recently in Belgium, a Muslim party is preparing to campaign to set up an Islamic State in Belgium. Well, why? Here's the reason. Because two Islamic figures, two Islamic people, have now won seats in an election. And they're demanding that churches be torn down and mosques built instead. Now, my question is, if you were completely satisfied in your country, why did you move out of Saudi Arabia, out of Iraq, out of your majority Islamic country? Why did you go to another country and try to tear down churches? Why don't you give us some light on this, Dr. David?
Well, you know, from a Christian perspective, I think God is saying to the Christian world, you've ignored Muslims for more than 1,000 years. And first, I allowed you to build up the greatest civilization in world history based on oil. And then I gave all the oil to the Muslims. And you didn't listen then. So now that Muslim societies are in collapse, and they are, they're coming to the West to escape from what can only be described as the failure of Islam. And the way I say that is, over the last 50 years, the Muslim world has experienced the greatest religious revival, an Islamic religious revival, in world history, in which a significant portion of the Muslim world has moved deeper and deeper into Islamic faith and practice. You have to ask yourself the question, what has been the fruit of all of this? Well, the fruit is pretty obvious to see. Look across the Muslim world. Algeria is a failed state. Libya is a failed state. Somalia is a failed state. Syria is a failed state. Yemen is a failed state. Afghanistan is a failed state. In other words, wherever this revival has gone, it has ripped the fabric of these countries to pieces and has led to a situation where millions of Muslims are looking for a way out. I think most of them go to the West simply to escape from the oppression, from the corruption, from the dictatorship, which is endemic to Islam. What is a caliph, if not a dictator? Someone who essentially controls everything. And if you look across the Muslim world, they have not been able, except in those countries that are quite distant from Islam, like Indonesia, but anywhere that's in the real center cultural sphere of Islam, Middle East, North Africa, Iran, and so forth, you just simply can't develop representative democracy because the paradigm is Muhammad, and Muhammad was a dictator.
Amen. Yes, but we can't just simply say that without showing any proof, Dr. David. We must back up what we're saying by proofs, and by proofs, the Muslims will only believe in the Quran and the Hadith and the Sirat and all of that. So we must show some proof in order to hone in on what we're talking about, whether it's true or not. And so we're going to do that. Now, this is a primary example of what's happening in Belgium. Is, you give an inch, they want to take a mile. And we see this in the Quran as well. We see when Muhammad was the lower, not the majority, he was the minority. He will say, to you be your faith and to mine be my faith. But then when he's the majority is, you turn to Islam by the sword, otherwise I kill you. And if you do turn to Islam, you will have to pay a heavier tax called the jizya. But let's talk about that for a little bit. In majority of the Islamic countries, we have what is called Sharia law. Now, this is the law that they must abide by. And who made that all up? It's exactly the Khalifas that you had mentioned earlier, and Muhammad himself. So whatever Muhammad does is allowed to happen in these countries. Whatever Abu Bakr did or Ali did, whatever the Khalifas, the first Imams did, you must abide by those things. So for an example, if Muhammad can marry Aisha at age 6, you can now marry at age 6. If he consummated the marriage at age 9, you can consummate the marriage at age 9. So those things are available in the Middle East, and it's a law called Sharia law. So let's talk about this for a little bit. Sharia law is the code that is derived directly, like I said earlier, from the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad. This is applicable only to Muslims. But if I'm living in a majority Islamic country, it's applicable to me as well, because I'm living in that country. Now, when Muslims come to the West, or to the UK, or to Belgium, UK, Europe, and America, we've already established rules to live by. Now it's in the works where they're trying to bring in their own rules and change everything back to Sharia law, to live as if we're living in the time of Muhammad. Why? We're subject under rules already, and these rules have been working out for America for the longest. America's the best place to live in. The United States is the best place to live in throughout the whole world. Why? It's because they've already got laws established. Now, for me, when it comes to Muslims and talking to Muslims, I see that a lot of them in the West are westernized. In other words, they're not real Muslims, but they would like to have Sharia law happen. But when Sharia law does happen, a lot of heads would be rolling. What is your opinion on Sharia law, Dr. David? And since you've been dealing with Muslims a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just give you an example. You mentioned the whole area of child marriage. Yeah. Recently, the New York Times did an article on child marriage in the Muslim world. And as soon as I began to read the article, I asked myself the question, are they going to get to the crux of the issue, or are they going to avoid it? And the interesting thing was that throughout the entire article, there was not a single mention of the Sunnah, the practices of the Prophet. There were only various, I would say, probably moderate Muslims who are saying, well, this has nothing to do with Islamic law and has nothing to do with Muhammad. And my thought is, they really can't be that dumb. Although I found it astonishing that the New York Times swallowed everything that they said hook, line, and sinker. And I thought to myself, now, if this had been material about a problem with child marriage in Christianity, and you had an example of that in the life of Jesus, would the New York Times neglect to tell us about it? There is a gigantic double standard here, but I think what's happening in the Muslim world today is that as groups like ISIS, as groups like even the governments of Iran and Saudi Arabia push Sharia and push the rules of Islam, which you can read, any 12-year-old can read them in any masjid in the United States. Bukhari's hadith is widely available everywhere. And there it's very clearly spelled out what the policies are. And they are based on the behaviors or the sunnah of the Prophet himself. Now, I'll grant you that many of these hadiths were invented centuries later to explain an empire that Islam had become, and Muhammad never ruled over an empire. So a lot of those hadiths, political hadiths in particular, were inventions of a later age. But in the area of social behaviors, you have essentially the behavior of a 7th century Arab being universalized as the perfect pattern of behavior for every human being on planet Earth, which of course leads to all kinds of absurdities. One of them being child marriage, another being sex slavery, another being the treatment of captive women. Another would be the treatment of non-Muslim minorities and the apartheid state that Islamic law establishes, where non-Muslims are treated as second-class citizens and have to pay special taxes and are eventually more or less eradicated. If you look at the Muslim world today, it's the only part of the world that is religiously undiverse. You have numerous Muslim countries that are 100% or 99% Muslim. And it's not because everybody just found Islam so wonderful they had to convert to it. They either converted or they left because it was just intolerable to live under that system. The absurdity of this is, of course, saying that somehow this should apply everywhere on planet Earth. For instance, we had one that we joked about, a hadith we joked about in Bangladesh, which said you're not allowed to collect and dry grass. You know, and I can understand in the desert of Saudi Arabia, collecting all the grass and leaving nothing for anybody else would, you know, be something perhaps you shouldn't do. But if you're living in Sweden or North America, where you have to store up grass by the ton to feed your animals through the winter, this law is obviously ridiculous. And it doesn't take much reading in the Hadith to find hundreds of such rules. Hundreds of them that make absolutely no sense in other cultural contexts. And this is one of the questions I often ask Muslims. I had a conversation with a fellow in the masjid in Nagoya, Japan, where I said to him, what is God's purpose with ethno-linguistic cultural diversity? And of course, in the Bible, you have a powerful theology of culture and God's intention and purpose with it. In Islam, the best I can get is that the Quran tells you make up names this way. So we have somebody called al-Baghdadi because he's from Baghdad, or you've got somebody called al-Amriki because he's from America. In other words, other than names, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity is actually somehow outside the will of God, that everybody on planet Earth should behave like a 7th century Arab. And this is manifestly ridiculous. And I think more and more young Muslim people are getting into the Hadith, partly because the radical organizations saturate their propaganda films with Quran and Sunnah.
Yeah.
I have watched all of Dawla Islamiya's or ISIS's films, and they are saturated with the Prophet's behavior. And they will say things like Manhaj al-Nubuwah, the methods of the Prophet.
Yeah, but we're going too far.
Chapter and verse.
We're going a little far. I see what you're saying. Let's back it up a little, because you mentioned a lot that we have to mention one by one, because we want to give the audience a chance to look at what we're saying. So for an example, you mentioned the hadith. I'd like to give the name of the hadith and the place where they can go and find it. So let's do that one by one. So Dave, you had mentioned just a little bit earlier, if these people are not living, these non-Muslims that are converting to Muslims, they're not living there and recognizing how beautiful is Islam. Let me just convert to it. No, they have to convert to it by the sword. If you remember the apostate wars, the Ridda wars in Arabic, those wars happened after Muhammad died. A bunch of Muslims left Islam, all right? They all left. And Abu Bakr said, I'm going to go back and get them with the sword. He didn't say, I'm going to go back and get them by intellectually talking to them, convincing them, showing them the truth about this religion. No, he went out and got them by the sword. So living under Sharia law.
The wars is what you're talking about.
The Ridda wars, yeah. So the apostate wars as well. So with these wars that are happening, if Muslims today would lift this boot that is on the necks of non-Muslims, lift this boot that's on the neck of non-Muslims by saying, you're truly you are freely able to leave Islam should you want to without any consequence. You'll see no Muslims on this earth except for the extremists. And why do I say that? Because we have Muslims, we have Christians we have Muslims, leaving Islam and going into the Christian faith by the pounds. I mean, there are about, in Africa, 16,000 are leaving. 16,000 Muslims are becoming Christians per day, per day. That's over 5-6 million a year. They're leaving that faith. That's only in Africa. But you don't see this on the news. And guess what? What I just quoted to you, Dave, is a report by Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is an Islamic news station. Muslims work there. Muslims are writing to Muslims. They're talking about news to Muslims. So they had to say this fact. But I bet you what? If you were to call MSNBC or CNN and tell them, hey, how about this report? No, they would care nothing about it because the left is with Islam. But we don't want to get into politics just yet. We want to remind the callers that our phone lines are now open. The phone number is 248-416-1300. If you have any comment, any objection, any question for either me or Dr. David, you're more than welcome to call. We'll take your call right away. We'll pause the show. Theft is punishable by the amputation of the right hand according to Sharia law. Where are we getting this from? In chapter 5, verse 38, the thief, the male and the female, amputate their hands in recompense for what they committed as a deterrent punishment from Allah, and Allah is exalted, mighty, and wise. Punishable by cutting off the hand, and this is done by God. Now, why didn't God show this in the beginning, ever since the time of Moses and Abraham, or during the time of Jesus? And then I have this hadith to back it up. Bulugh al-Maram, that's in book 10, hadith 1267. Cut off the thief's hand by for a quarter of a dinar, and do not cut it off for what is less than that. For something, a quarter of a dinar is an Arabic currency, Iraqi currency. You cut off for less than a quarter, you don't. Anything over a quarter of a dinar, you do. Now let's talk about this, and in case somebody's saying that I am misinterpreting the topic here. In the Arabic, it says, وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَاقْطَعُوا أَيْدَهُمَا جَزَاءً بِمَا كَسَبَ نَكَالٍ مِنَ اللَّهِ. So go ahead and cut off their hand as a jizya. Here's that word again that's mentioned in chapter 9, verse 29, as a penalty for what they have done. Now, was this good? Let's just think about this for a minute, you and I, Dave, and let's be logical about this. Will it deter theft? You might say yes or no, because I don't want my hand being cut off. It will deter theft. But what if a person made a mistake? What if I made a mistake and I said, Dave, I saw you steal that watermelon. And it wasn't you. It was a person who looked exactly like you. But by then, I already cut off your hand. I already went to the authorities and the hand was cut off. Can I put your hand back? No, it's gone forever. What if I was influenced by outside forces to go ahead and steal? How would that make it my fault? What if somebody told me I would go ahead and kill your wife if you don't steal this for me? I had a good reason for me to do that, even though stealing is bad, but I had a good reason for me to do that. What if, like I said, you were falsely accused? What if the person was to steal because they had nothing else? Nothing else. They had no money. They're completely bankrupt financially. Nobody would even look at them. And they stole something because they want to survive. They want to live. And you saw this poor person and said, no, your hand must be cut off. What good is that going to do? Why not you say, hey, I'm going to offer you a job since this is the reason why you're stealing. And you'd have to pay for what you just stole 4 times as much. If you remember a story, Dr. Dave, in the Bible, I believe is in Luke chapter 14. Jesus goes to this person, Zacchaeus. He goes to his house. And he is a tax collector. And as we know from the Bible, from history, that tax collectors tend to take more. They steal from the people than to take more than what they have to give to Caesar's tax. They take the rest for themselves. Even if it's not money, they'll take some other things like a cow or a sheep or something that means income in that place, in that century. So when he was over his house, and this Zacchaeus heard the gospel and heard about Jesus and who he was, he said, I will give back 4 times as much. Jesus didn't tell him, your hand must be cut off. That wasn't a law. That wasn't a rule. Your hand must be cut off, and then you're not supposed to work for the rest of your life because hands are what brings forth labor and money. No, Zacchaeus said, I will give back to the people what I have taken 4 times as much. And that was justice in God's eyes. But justice, obviously, in Islam is completely different, specifically talking about chapter 5, verse 38 of the Quran. What do you have to say about this, Dr. Dave?
Well, I actually know you've done some prison ministry, and I've been involved in prison ministry for 12 years, working with various prisoners. And it's a disturbing fact that there are many people in prison who are not guilty of the crimes for which they have been imprisoned. Now, this is not all the time happening, but it's frequent and common enough that you can see the rationale behind saying, let's not do irreversible punishments. Because once you've done the punishment, you have essentially removed the possibility for justice to be done. And this is what is wrong with Islamic law. It's based on the concept of fear, that we will get people to do things by means of fear, and that we believe that this always establishes the righteousness of God. It's interesting that Muhammad himself sometimes contradicts this aspect. When they capture a guy from the Quraysh one time before the Battle of Badr, and the Muslims are beating him up as they're interrogating him, and Muhammad says, no, don't do that. That's not going to work. He's just going to tell you what he thinks you want to hear. So do it gently, and you'll get better information. And in a sense, Muhammad contradicts the principles of Islamic law when he says that. So the had punishments of death and stoning and chopping off of hands and feet are also very amenable to unrighteousness. We had stories in Bangladesh that circulated of how people would do plots against somebody else, and they would go to an Islamic court, and 4 witnesses would declare a certain person had said something or done something, and that was their way of getting revenge on that person, because in Islamic law, the testimony of 4 witnesses is sufficient. It also shows you how ridiculous some of these punishments can be, where, if you are committing adultery, which is punishable by stoning, you'd have to have 4 eyewitnesses to your act, which would really be getting stoned for terminal stupidity. In other words, there would be very few cases where this would ever actually come to trial. And yet it does come to trial with some frequency, and clearly can be a case. And I watched one ISIS film where a young girl was stoned to death with her own father leading the stoning. And I thought to myself, wow, what happens if this is a false accusation? What a horrendous thing to do. And by the way, I think part of this comes out of Islam's conception of God himself. The God of Islam is an angry, vicious, brutal God who does not care about human suffering. He could not care less. And that's why he seems to enjoy these kinds of punishments. One of my Muslim friends from way back, Daud Rahbar, this is one of the reasons he turned to Christianity. He made a statement that was very powerful. He said, I cannot worship a God that does not understand human suffering. And the God of Islam does not understand human suffering. He could not care less about it. He enjoins it in all kinds of circumstances. So I couldn't agree with you more. There is something quite brutal. And I think the idea that you function based on fear is really Islam's greatest downfall. Why are terrorists proliferating throughout the Muslim world? Because they've learned this. If you really want to control people, use fear to do it.
Yeah.
And what does Christ call us to? He calls us to love. And the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear.
Yeah. So hate would be the absence of love, just like cold is the absence of heat. So that's a very good explanation. But if we pay attention, Dr. Dave, to the verse that was just said in chapter 5, verse 38, when a person steals, you cut off their hand as a recompense for what they've done. Now, this is the law of God. This is Allah supposedly brought it down to Muhammad. Let's go to Sunan an-Nisa. Let's go to Sunan an-Nisa 4977. The English translation, you'll find it in volume 5, book 46, hadith 4980. They brought a thief to the Prophet. The Prophet said, kill him. what your God said in chapter 5, verse 38, just cut off the hands. He said, no, 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 kill him. So obviously we have Muhammad going against the rules of his own God, which we'll find that he does that a lot. That's first. Second, they said to him, O Messenger of Allah, he only stole. That's all he did. He's not deserving of death. He said, kill him. Again, going against his own God's law. But they said to him, O Messenger of Allah, he only stole something. He said, okay, cut off his hand. So now he's in agreement with his God. Then he stole again. The same person, he stole again. He said his foot was to be cut off. So remember, you have one hand, one foot cut off. Then he stole again. And then his other foot was cut off. Okay, so now we have no feet, one hand. Then he stole at the time of Abu Bakr, while all his extremities had been cut off. Then what are you going to do? You're going to cut off the fourth hand. He's got no hands. He's got no feet. Explain to me how he could steal again, because the hadith said, then he stole a fifth time. What else are you going to cut off? His head, his torso? What else are you going to cut off? His feet are gone. His hands are gone. He stole again for the fifth time. I mean, is this fabricated or what? Or is this true? And he somehow stole without having hands, without having feet. He just used his mouth and he bit an apple that was on the market and nobody saw that. And then he stole a fifth time, and Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, the Messenger of Allah, knew better about him, and he said, kill him. That's the reason why he said, kill him. So Muhammad knew better than Allah in chapter 5, verse 38, when Allah said, you only cut off the hands. Muhammad knew better than his own God, cut off all the hands, cut off all the feet that are there, and then he stole for a fifth time, and then I don't know what else was cut off, it doesn't mention it. But that's why he said, kill him. That's what you're supposed to do. You just kill him right away because I knew the future. Really? No, you didn't. You went against your own God. This story says that he stole for the fifth time when there's no fifth part that he could steal with. What else? No hands, no feet. What else can he steal with? Anyways.
Well,
so,
let me just mention something. There's actually an even more famous case where a hadith abrogates, it makes naskh of a Quranic passage. The Quran enjoins 100 lashes for someone who commits adultery, and then that verse of the Quran is abrogated. And remember, Quran is supposedly, tanzil. Allah speaks it through the angel Gabriel like water through a faucet coming through the prophet.
Yeah.
So Muhammad has nothing to do with that. But then Muhammad can make a statement in the hadith, one of his sunnah, that says they should be stoned to death, and that replaces the Quranic verse, which creates a situation which, frankly, I think flowed out of the terrible temptation that Muhammad fell for when he moved from supposedly Mecca to Medina and went on the warpath and began to establish. Because if you look at the Quran before the Hijrah, it was Muhammad calling people to obey Allah. When he gets to Mecca, that adage is changed. It now becomes obey Allah and obey his prophet. And Muhammad, in some senses, goes beyond just being the mouthpiece of God, through whom God speaks, but he becomes the one whose very own ideas. And if you think about it, Sunnah is different from Quran. This is Muhammad talking, not Allah talking. I'll grant you there are some supposed hadiths that are Allah talking, but we're not talking about those. We're talking about where clearly Muhammad is doing the talking, and this has more authority than what Allah says. And that is an example, I think, of absolute power corrupting, that he is gradually seduced by his position as the mouthpiece of God, such that even Khadijah says at one point, methinks, O Prophet, that God hastens to do your will. Mm-hmm. And all of that indicates that when you try to create a complete code of life, as Muslims like to say about the Quran, a complete set of politics based on 7th century Arab behavior, you're going to have some huge problems. It simply doesn't apply in the modern age. It simply doesn't work. And I would argue that the Muslim world, apart from large infusions of outside cash, whether it's by oil money or whether it's by money being sent to the Palestinian Authority or other groups or paying off, to get hostages back. Apart from that kind of outside help from non-Muslims that somehow backs up the political structure, that Islam is a system of warfare that simply cannot function well unless it's conquering new areas and gaining new booty to fund itself.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, you do. And without that, Islam would not be around. So, how about criticizing any part or denying any part of the Quran is punishable by death? While you can do so with the Bible, with any other supposed holy book, you can do that. But if you just go against or criticize the Quran, it is punishable by death. So, this does not allow any critical thinker, any intellectual, to question whether the Quran is correct or not. And when supposedly Allah gave this command out, He ruined it for all mankind to see how horrible the Quran is, with all due respect. The Quran doesn't have any stories that end properly or begin properly. The only story that is there from beginning to end is the story of Joseph. But other than that, we have stories that start at the beginning and don't have an end. We have a story that goes in the end but doesn't have any beginning, or right in the middle. We have characters that we know nothing about other than reading the hadith, which came 200-300 years after the Quran. In chapter 111, Abu Lahab, we don't know who he is unless we go to the Quran, where when it says children of Israel, Bani Israel, who are they according to the Quran? You would not know according to the Quran and the Quran only. So we have all these things that are happening in the Quran, and you expect us as critical thinkers to believe in it. Now, if we were to criticize the Quran and we find zero fallacy in it, then we would say, all right, this is the book of God. That was actually my journey and how I came to know Jesus Christ. I was trying to find all kinds of mistakes, all kinds of contradictions in the Bible so that I can choose not to believe in it. But I couldn't. I was overwhelmed by the evidence. But when I did the same thing with the Quran, no, it failed and it was miserable. So that's why I decided to leave the Quran and not become a Muslim, but become a true Christian. So criticizing the Quran is punishable by death. Where am I getting this from? Chapter 33, verse 59 through 61. I'm not going to read it all, but towards the end of that chapter it says, "We shall arouse you, O Prophet, against them, and they will only be your neighbors in the city for a short while. They will reject wherever they are found, seize them and kill them." Why? Because the verse right before say they did not believe in the Quran. There's another one that I find the story, I'm very fond of the story. It's in Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 4, number 2934. You can also find it in Sahih Muslim, volume 3, numbers 4422 and then 4424. Uqba harassed and mocked the Prophet. So if I harass and mock the Prophet, this might happen to me. He harassed and mocked the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca and wrote derogatory verses about him. This is in Surah 83, verse 13. He was captured during the Battle of Badr in AD 624, and Muhammad ordered him to be executed. "But who will look after my children, O Muhammad?" Uqba cried out with anguish as he is being tortured before his death. The Prophet of Islam said, "Hell will look after your children." Hell restored to the Prophet coldly. Then the sword of one of the followers cut through Uqba's neck, and I gave you exactly where it is. So why do that? If I choose to criticize Muhammad, this should give you, as a Muslim, an opportunity for you to display how beautiful your Prophet is and how good he is and how righteous he is. So this should be an opportunity for you to overcome this objection that I am raising up. But as soon as anybody writes something negative about the Prophet or says something about the Prophet or even about the Quran, this will happen to me. And not only me, Uqba was worried about his children. Muhammad made sure that he's going to go out after his children and put that fear in Uqba by saying, "Hell will look after your children."
Yeah.
Look at.
Well, can I give you an example?
Sure.
I think it's important that we understand why the law against criticizing Muhammad and the Quran was promulgated. Let me give you just one small example. If you read all of the surahs of the Quran that were written in supposedly Mecca, there is not a negative thing said about Jews anywhere in those surahs. As soon as you get to Medina, basically everything, and we're talking 264 different verses in the Medinan surahs, and there's nothing but universal condemnation of the Jews. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, why? Why this radical change in the content of the Quran? Well, I think what happened was Muhammad came to Medina, and for the first time, he was in contact, in communication with a large community of Jews who were, as many scholars have put it, the Jews are a profoundly textual people who revere holy books, and they read holy books, and they study the history, and they're very, very learned people. That's why they have produced so many Nobel Prize laureates, because they've been a literary nation for 3,000 years. So Muhammad comes to the Jews in Medina, and he says, I have a new Torah for you, in essence. And he begins to recite his surahs, and they are full, from a Jewish perspective, and even from a purely secular perspective, of howling historical errors. Howlers like Pharaoh practices crucifixion. Well, this was invented by the Romans, 1,500 years later. King David is wearing chainmail. Well, chainmail was invented by the Celts in around 300 BC. We're talking 700 years after the time of King David. So you have these, just on a purely secular point of view, massive mistakes in the Quran. And then if you get into the religious histories, the Quran is absolute chaos, full of all kinds of mixed up ideas. Muhammad tells the story of the plagues of Egypt and Moses in Egypt, and he starts out thinking that Moses is a prophet to the Egyptians, and then gradually figures out, oh no, actually he's going to get the Israelites, but yeah, and he used a plague. Oh no, maybe it was 2 plagues, no, maybe it was 3, maybe it was 4, maybe it was 5, maybe it was 6, and he never gets to the correct total, and he never gets to the main point of the Passover. So the Jews could not but reject Muhammad. That, their reaction is, this book is absolutely not a book from God, because it's got so many errors in it. It's so completely mixed up that this has nothing to do with God. Right. Now, when you've got a community at the heart of your new political empire who have the means, by their learned studies of history and the scriptures, to tear your Quran apart, they are a grave danger to you. And so Muhammad did a number of things early on. You'll find this in the Hadith. He told his people, don't talk to the Jews. Don't show a Quran to the Jews. Eventually, the campaign became, let's drive all the Jews out of Medina. And eventually, he carries out a genocide of slaughtering all of the Jews, the males of Banu Qurayza, and gives the women to his soldiers to use as sex slaves. He takes one of those women himself. The whole point here is, these people are a threat to us because they can use critical thinking to show what's wrong with my holy book. And from that point on, Muhammad begins to promulgate ideas about, no one is allowed to criticize my book. This is God talking. Anybody who does should be executed. Anyone who mocks the prophet is equally in danger of execution. You have numerous stories of assassination squads sent out to murder Jews and others who mock the prophet. All of that because his book simply does not stand up to critical scrutiny. It disintegrates under critical scrutiny. And I think Muhammad recognized the danger that if he's going to be able to establish a religion based on that book, he's got to suppress all critical discussion. And you could say that that's still true today. The average Western writer will not say a negative thing about the Quran. They'll just say, well, that's okay for them. That's their sacred history, and all sacred history is, from a secular point of view, equally nonsensical. One of the things that I often do to study different religious texts is to ask the question, how many verifiable historical locations are found in these texts? If you go to the Bhagavad Gita, you'll find hardly any, because the Bhagavad Gita is a fairy tale, and it has nothing to do with history. If you go into the Quran and you ask the question, how many place names are there in the Quran? Well, there are only 9. And they're found in a total of 63 different places, but 7 of those 9, including 60 of those locations, nobody knows where they are. They're unknown. It's just vague and unclear. The only 3 mentions that are made, 2 are of Medina, 1 is of Mecca. These are historically verifiable locations. Now, if you come to the New Testament, you have hundreds. Well, if you take Old and New Testament, you have hundreds of verifiable historical locations that archaeology has indicated existed at the time that the Bible said it existed in the form that the Bible describes. So when you're reading the Bible, you are reading something that is verifiably connected to actual history. The Quran is not.
Yes, amen. So thank you for giving us that long topic. We appreciate that. Now, let's try our best to stick with the Sharia law, even though archaeological evidence really, really helps. And I want to point out that our phone lines are now open. The phone number is 248-416-1300. You have any questions, comments, or objections, please call. I always get people that are just commenting negatively on the Trinity Channel Facebook page, but they never called. I'd like for you guys to call and have a conversation so that way we can just talk about these things and hash it out. Because if you're going to just go on Facebook or on YouTube and not come on the show and talk, that shows that maybe what we're mentioning is a little embarrassing to you and you don't want to go up against it. But let's talk about something that is more, I don't know, it's a little bit harsh that Muhammad had chosen to do. But it is what it is, and we have to mention it. A girl's clitoris should be cut off according to Muhammad. A girl's clitoris should be cut off according to Muhammad. This is in Muhammad's words in his book, Kitab al-Adab, book 41, hadith 5251. Also in Sunan Abu Dawood, book 41, number 5251. This is a woman talking, narrated Atiyah al-Nasiriyah. A woman used to perform circumcision in Medina. The Prophet said to her, "Do not cut severely, as that is better for a woman and more desirable for a man." How in the world is this better for a woman? You meant to say this is more desirable for a man only because it will feel better. So even here, Muhammad is negating women, and he is putting women down for the sake of making them feel better as sexual objects to men. That is it. They have zero value, zero worth, as opposed to Christianity, when we as men are supposed to put our lives on the line for our wives, just as Jesus did for us on the cross in Ephesians chapter 5. So even in dealing with men and women, there is a completely different way of treatment. All right. There's another one in Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 5, book 59, number 399. When the army aligned to fight, Siba came out and said, "Is there any Muslim to accept my challenge to a duel?" Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib came out and said, "O Siba, O Ibn Anmar, to the one who circumcises other ladies, do you challenge Allah and His apostle?" Then Hamza attacked and killed him, and so on. So I was just giving you 2 references that during the time of Muhammad, until this day, there were 2 doctors captured in Dearborn, Michigan, where they were taken in jail and imprisoned for a very long time because they were performing circumcision of younger girls. What is the reason for that? We have a reason for the circumcision of men, specifically speaking on the 8th day, because there's a specific vitamin called vitamin K that is on the rise on that 8th day, but not on the 7th and not on the 9th. Scientifically speaking, this would be good for us as men. What is good for women to be circumcised on that day, and specifically speaking, little girls? And a woman can have up to 1 husband, but a man can have up to 4 wives. And that's it, 4 wives. And in chapter 4, verse 3, we talk about marriage. Well, the Muslim would talk about a marriage in the Quran, talking about this is marriage in English, but in Arabic, it is not marriage. The word there is فَأَنْكِحُ. فَأَنْكِحُ means go ahead and have sex with them with as much up to 3. It starts off with 2, 3, and 4. Why does it start off with 2? Why not start off with 1? But it starts off with 2 or 3 or 4. And then this is a command of God, right? Allah gave this command. Muhammad goes against the command of Allah. He has up to 11 or 13 wives at once. Why do that? Why are you going against your own God's command? And you're forcing the people, specifically the women, to do something, to defer their bodies, to alter their bodies in order for the man to feel better. So from this, Dr. Dave, we're seeing over and over again that this is a man's religion. On this earth, you have as many wives as you can, as many as 4 wives, I'm sorry. In heaven, you will have up to 72 virgins, and even some of them will be standing in a corner just watching. I have that hadith for us. And these are only specifically for men. So it seems like Muhammad is doing his best to try to get the men to join him, to join his movement, to join his cult, if I dare say. And it seems like that, as you've said earlier, that when a person shows you such atrocities in the afterlife and in this life, if you don't follow him, then you're not following him for him. You're following him for what God is offering, such as women, 72 virgins in heaven, women on this earth as much as you can, but not so much for the women. In 2 to 3 minutes, Dr. Dave, if you can comment on that a little bit, because we have a lot of material to get through.
Well, just 2 quick things to mention. The first is, if you're dealing with FGM, female genital mutilation, if you look at the Sunni madhabs, the schools of law, 2 of them, all of them consider this meritorious, and 2 of them actually require it. So when people say this has nothing to do with Islam, it's just tribal custom, that's nonsense. It is central to thinking of how a woman should be treated. Now, I'll just mention that, and you can find similar things in all of the madhabs concerning what you've mentioned here. What is really difficult is this simple question. How can you reform a religion when you're not allowed to criticize it? And this is really Islam's greatest problem. When Muhammad forbade criticism of the Quran and criticism of himself, which means criticism of any of his behaviors as found in the hadith, as found in the sunnah, as found in the manhaj, if you will, the style or the practices or the habits or the principles of Muhammad. If you can't criticize them and they are a complete code of life, then there's really absolutely no grounds for reform within Islam. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed this, but in Indonesia, the leader of the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia has essentially said this and said, we have to change our culture and to allow for the critique of Sunnah and Quran, because otherwise we cannot ever reform Islam. So I think that the radicals and the people who teach this stuff are actually doing us a favor. Because our own people in the West, the New York Times is not going to tell us about this. They're going to cover it up because this is Islamophobia, right? Yeah. Which is a nice way of saying no one's allowed to criticize. We just shut it all down. It's all covered up. And so Westerners don't seem to be able to figure this out. Well, Muslims are figuring it out and saying if we don't find a way to critique this stuff, we can't reform, and we're not going to be able to enter into the 19th century, let alone coming into the 21st century. And when the money from oil runs out, Muslim world is in grave danger of collapse, because this revival of the last 50 years has pushed Muslim societies to the brink of collapse.
That's right. Well, thank you for that. We, again, want to remind the audience, the phone lines are open, 248-416-1300. I'm seeing a lot of strife that is going on in the comment section on Facebook, going back and forth. Again, just call. We will not shut you down. We will not cut you off. And I'm speaking to a particular person that comes on the show pretty much every time, but yet claims we don't give her or him the time to do that. How about men beating their women into subordination in chapter 4, verse 34? Where it literally said to adrabuhun, that means go ahead and hit them. And it doesn't mean you hit them with something as thin as this pen or a stick. Actually, the a thing that you could hit them with is a stick that was so, it was thicker during the time of Muhammad. We have the hadith for you as well. But I hear a lot of Muslims that are saying, Muhammad came and he's a feminist and he's freeing a lot of women and how do you see that at all? According to chapter 4, verse 24, you can take women as captives in war booty as well, and without the war booty that we've shown before. And it shows mut'a in there, istamta'tum bihi, that means you go ahead and had fun with it. Or in chapter 4, verse 34, where it says that you can actually hit them, and here is that. Men are in charge of women by what Allah has given one over the other hand, and what they may spend from their wealth. That means if I'm spending money on you, I'm allowed to hit you because you're not my property. I'm spending money on you. Or they are a till to you. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in absence of what Allah have guarded them. But those wives from among you who fear arrogance, first you advise them. Then if it says in parentheses, anytime it says anything in parentheses, it does not exist in the Arabic language. Then in parentheses, if they persist, forsake them. No, the word there is not forsake. وَأَجْرُهُنْ. That means to trap them. وَأَهْرُجُوهُنْ. To trap them. Some might say to even put ropes on their hands and on their feet and tie them to the bed. This is not forsake them. This is to trap them in Arabic. And then finally, you would strike them. وَأَضْرُبُوهُنْ. That means to strike, to hit, to physically hit. But I hear a lot of Muslims are saying, no, this is only with a stick, right? With a stick as thin as a toothpick.
I've heard a feather.
A feather. But let's see if this feather can do this, which Muhammad said this was okay by not going against it. In the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 7, number 715, I'm only going to read the first part of it because this is quite important, and then we go on from there because it's quite long. Narrated Ikramah, Rifa divorced the wife, whereupon Abdul Rahman married her. Aisha said to the lady, came wearing a green veil and complained to her, and Aisha showed up, and Aisha showed her a green spot on her skin, caused by the beating. So this woman came complaining about her husband, that he's beating her. Aisha lifts up the shirt and says, hey, there's this green spot made from the beating, right? It was the habit of the ladies to support each other. So when Allah's messenger came, Aisha said, I have not seen any women, plural, women, not just one, any women suffering as much as the believing women, plural again. So we see that women were suffering a lot during the time of Muhammad. But hold on, Muslims, I thought he was supposed to free. He was a feminist. He was freeing women from subjugation. Not the case. Aisha continues and says, look, her skin is greener than her clothes. When Abdul Rahman heard that, his wife had gone to the Prophet. He came with his two sons, and he said, by Allah, that means he's swearing, I have done nothing wrong. He is impotent and he's useless to me. But the husband says, well, I've given it to her two kids. Look at these kids. And Allah's messenger said that, are these your sons? On that, Abdul Rahman said, yes. The Prophet said, you claim what you claim. That is impotent. But by Allah, these boys resemble him as the crow resembles a crow. So in other words, they look exactly like him. He is not incompetent, as you've said. And we're okay with this. He doesn't punish him for it. He doesn't say, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're punishing women. What a person would naturally say if he was a feminist or for women, for relieving them, freeing them of the subjugation of that time. I'll give it to you in about 3 minutes. Please give us what you have to say about this, Dr. Dave.
Well, I have read some Islamic feminists' take on chapter 4, verse 34, and they all eventually run into a problem with how you actually do exegesis on the beating aspect. The word there is used numerous times in the Quran, even of use in beating someone in battle. So it's clearly not about using a feather. It's clearly not about, a nice, short little unthreatening kind of stick. It is beating in the truest sense of the word. Now, it is true that Islamic law did forbid certain practices like female infanticide, which was also true in the Christian world. That was considered to be a great sin. So Islam followed in some trains of reform that were positive, but the problem is that it froze the development at that point and allowed for no further development. And so there are many other aspects of how women should be treated. I mean, the fact that a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's in a court of law, which creates a circumstance in which if a woman accuses a man of rape, she, by her own mouth, has admitted to fornication. And if she can't produce 4 male witnesses, her testimony doesn't stand in court. And now she's liable to be punished for adultery, which could mean, being stoned to death in certain Islamic courts of law. So at that point, you basically have a situation where no woman is ever going to accuse a man of rape, because if she does so, she's almost certainly going to get herself killed in the process. And there are numerous other kinds of issues like this. And all of this flows out of the fact that Islamic jurisprudence has not developed in 800 years. It has not progressed beyond medieval thinking and medieval logic. And that is why it simply does not work. In much of the Muslim world, this kind of law was replaced by Western law because it was developed and it was allowed to develop over thousands of years and to take into account a more sophisticated understanding of proof and of who's right and who's wrong and testimony and that kind of thing. What's happening now in the Muslim world is as they go back to Islamic law, they are winding the clock backwards at least 1,000 years because there's been no development since the 13th century. So 800 years going back in time. And of course, in that kind of a context, women have no rights. And I kind of am amused at Islamic feminists because ultimately they're always based on what I would call false exegesis. In other words, they do eisegesis. They read back into the texts what they want to see there. But if you understand the text as they were understood at the time, which is the foundation of Islamic law, then their interpretations disintegrate.
And he was talking about those infant girls. So the Muslims usually will have this practice during the time of Muhammad where they would put them in a box or wrap them and then bury them alive still. And he somehow came on the scene and demolished this. Actually, upon looking this up, I told this on the show to another person that I've debated before. I gave that person 10 years and I will give $10,000 to anybody who can prove such a thing took place. From any hadith, from any Quran, that they can prove that such a thing took place. As a matter of fact, it does not, it did not. The only thing that says something about that is that these infant girls, when being buried, spoke out of the grave to Allah about their atrocities. But that's it. He never stopped such a thing. He never went for such a thing. That is all hearsay, and I'd like to see some proof. Hopefully I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, you as the audience, whoever's watching, will get $10,000 from me. And I'm saying this on the show. This is how much I am sure of this thing, that it never took place. Otherwise, I would never say it on the show. I'm not a betting man. I'm not doing this because I enjoy going to the casinos and such. No, I'm just saying it because this is how sure I am about this folktale that is coming up now within the circles of Islam.
Can I give you a little example that I think you would find interesting, just very briefly?
Sure.
In the pagan law of the patria, which was true in the Roman Empire, a husband had the right up to and including killing his wife and his children. And there were no legal ramifications for doing that.
Wow.
This law of the patria was revoked when the Christian church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The first thing that they deconstructed was the law of the patria, and they promulgated new laws that said a man who kills his wife or who kills his children is guilty before the court of murder. And most people don't realize that pagan world was quite brutal, and Christianity was what brought in the initial reforms that changed that.
Yeah. So if Christianity changed that, that means it was in existence beforehand, right? And it wouldn't have been in existence after Christianity, since Christianity was the majority of the time. But if somehow it came back on the scene, again, I'd like to see some sort of evidence by Muslims, not talking about Islam today. So don't give me a professor that is saying this today. I'd like to see it in that century during that time that it took place. Because as Muslims who say, here's what Muhammad did. He came on the scene and he freed women. No, he approved the murder of women. He approved them getting beat. And he said that his own God came up with this in chapter 4, verse 34. And even, Dr. David, you mentioned that if a woman was to be raped, there needs to be 4 witnesses. That is correct. But the hadith actually says that these 4 witnesses need to see the whole sexual aspect put into action. In other words, if they were just in the room or if they were covered by a blanket, no. They need to see the male figure going into the female figure in order for them to be witnesses. So if somebody was raping somebody, you say, hold on, let me call 4 of my friends so they can see this. Bring your cameras too as well. What kind of stuff is that? What are we doing? What are we talking about? Why do there need to be 4 witnesses? I mean, in America here, if you just hit a dog, you might go to jail. So a dog has more value in America than a woman has in Islam. You're a human being, but you can be able to be hit and you're able to be raped, and 4 witnesses need to be there, otherwise nobody would come up. And therefore, the women, as you've said, are silenced when they are being raped. Because if they go up against the person who raped them, and they only have 2 or 3 witnesses, no. And majority of the time, they'll blame it on the women. It's your fault because you were wearing clothing that were very revealing. Therefore, it enticed the man to come and rape you. That is what we see in the news a lot, since I read the news about Islam a lot. But anyways, you mentioned that women are not as equal to men. That's completely correct. In chapter 4, verse 11, the male shall have the equal portions of 2 females. Chapter 2, verse 282, it's a very long chapter. Right in the middle it says that 1 man's testimony is equal up to 2 women's testimony. Chapter 2, verse 223 claims that your wives are as a tilth to you, as a dirt, as something that you just till the ground with. You just use them when you need them, and that's it. They're nothing but sexual objects that bring you forth kids on this world, in this world, and that's it. A woman can't even drive a car until recently in Saudi Arabia. A woman can't even speak to a man alone without her husband being there or her son being there. Muslims engage in taqiyya. We're mentioning all these things to you because this is what Sharia law consists of. And we started off the show by saying in Belgium, there were 2 Muslim people that won the election in an election. And because they won, they're now trying to put out all the churches and make them into mosques. And when that happens, Sharia law kicks in. Is Sharia law good for you based on what we've just said, if you're watching this? Based on what we've just said, is it good for you? Does it benefit mankind at all? Now, if you're a man, you might see it benefiting you. If you're a sexual, adulterous fornicator, this will be very, very good to you. But we see that this is exactly what Muhammad was through his writings, through his actions, and through the Quran as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about this word, taqiyya. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah, taqiyya.
It's lying in the face of another in order to make Muslims or make Islam spread. Let's talk a little bit about that, Dr. Dave. If you have any knowledge of this, go ahead and share it with us, please.
Well, it's interesting. When Westerners deal with the concept of taqiyya, Westerners will say, well, this is just people covering up their faith because they're threatened. And particularly amongst Shia Islam, this is a highly developed form because the Shia Muslims, as well as Ahmadiyyas today in Pakistan, often practice taqiyya to keep from being killed. And that is true, but that's not the origin of taqiyya. Taqiyya really originates in events that took place back in the time of Muhammad, when Muhammad sent out assassination squads to murder those who had made fun of him. And if you go into the Hadith or if you go into any of the Sirah books, there are numerous cases of this involving, in the case of Ibn Ishaq, probably 40 or 50 pages of narrative about assassination squads sent out to murder Jews and others. And in those contexts, the assassins would ask the Prophet, Well, in order for us to ingratiate ourselves with our victims to get close enough to them to be able to kill them, we shall have to tell lies. And the prophet gives them permission at that point. So the idea of taqiyya really began not as a way of protecting yourself, but as a way of being successful in a stratagem of war by which you could kill the leaders of your enemies. And that's really the core of taqiyya. That's where it came from. And so that's an aspect that simply is not discussed. I'll give you one quick example. Karen Armstrong, in her book on Muhammad, spends numerous pages talking about the supposed plot to assassinate Muhammad in Mecca. And even Ibn Ishaq, when he tells about this plot, expresses in the Arabic that this is probably not true because the story doesn't make sense. I mean, why in the world would you, finding out about a plot to kill you, why would you put your own son-in-law, Ali, in the bed in your place and leave him there, which would put his life in great danger? Because in the middle of the night with no electric lights, it'd be easy. They'd rush in and they'd stab the wrong guy. Why would you do this? So even Arab historiographers of the 7th and 8th centuries could understand this doesn't make sense. Karen Armstrong tells that story virtually as if it's a historical truth. And it's only a page in Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq has 35 or 40 pages on the assassination plots that were carried out, and that never gets a single mention in Karen Armstrong's book. Those plots have been examined for their historicity, and they are clearly historical. They actually happened. And it shows one of the great afflictions of Western scholarship is people will pick and choose stories according to what they'd like to hear, not what is true. And they will publish the stories that sound nice to them and ignore the stuff that may be far more historical that actually tells the truth. And all of that relates to this subject of taqiyya.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as he said, taqiyya is that exactly what it is. As he's claimed, you can lie in order to expand the Islamic movement or in order to expand Muslims' living quarters as well. So we've seen that a lot. You can just lie pretty much in any case. But Dr. Dave, some person might come up and say, well, hold on a second. Rahab in the Old Testament lied. She lied, and yet she was included in the line of Jesus, but she lied. What is the difference between the taqiyya of Islam and the lie of Rahab? If you have anything to say about that, please give us 2 minutes since time is fleeting from us and we have much more to cover.
Well, I would say there are two important differences. The first is Rahab's lie is never presented in the scripture as some kind of a righteous act. Mm-hmm. She's clearly trying to stay alive. Mm-hmm. And she's also thinking these guys are going to win the war and I want to side with the winners. So I'm going to tell a lie to protect myself and my family. In that sense, the scripture doesn't, because scripture doesn't pronounce anything about it, doesn't mean that you can assume that God approves lying. Mm-hmm. It simply tells the story. And the Bible tells lots of stories without providing any kind of a moral judgment on whether this was right or wrong. If you compare it with the overall principles of Scripture, you could say this was a lie. We don't encourage lying, but we can understand why the lady lied to save herself. That's quite different than Jesus, if we could imagine this, telling his disciples, okay, tell lies to the guards of Pontius Pilate so that you can get past them and then use the sword you smuggled in your robes to stab Pontius Pilate to death.
That's right.
That would be a very different kind of a scenario. The case of Rahab is not a justification for taqiyya. It's just illustrating human nature. When people are afraid, they tell lies.
That's right. And not only that, we see that in this, even in the example of Rahab, that God values life, righteous kind of living, more than actually killing. So for an example, if some man came into my house and I've got wife and kids that are in the house and he's got a gun to my head and he says, "Where's your wife?" Because I shouldn't lie, I should say, "Oh, she's right there," because I'm commanded by God not to lie. No, It's on me to protect those who I love, those who I think are righteous people in the eyes of the Lord through Jesus Christ. So it's my duty to protect them. And I believe the same thing that was happening with Rahab. She recognized what would take place. Not only is her life is in danger, but her life might not have been in danger if she told on these spies that came in, right? Maybe later on it would have been in danger. She would have fled the scene, but she recognized these are righteous people. They are abiding by God's law. I am into something like this. I love it. But in order for me to get over this hurdle, I'm going to have to tell a lie, just like in the case of a person that's coming into my house and wanting to kill my wife and children. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to lie in order to save human lives. Not so the case when it comes to taqiyya, and I can give you examples and examples, but time is fleeting. Let's talk about not taking unbelievers as friends. In chapter...
Al-walah wal-barah.
Yeah. So in chapter 3, verse 28, let not the believers take the disbelievers as awliya, which means supporters, friends, just helpers, instead of believers. And whoever does that will never be helped by Allah in any way except for indeed of fear of danger of them. So if you fear a danger of them, you practice taqiyya, but you're not supposed to, because they are unbelievers. Now we have a similar passage in the Bible where Paul is telling us, do not commingle with unbelievers, or do not marry, do not yoke with an unbeliever. But that's in marriage, and it's not the same here. And also in this is interesting, in chapter 9, verse 23, perhaps I am from a Muslim family and I now am a Christian. In chapter 9, verse 23, this is what God commands of you. O you who have believed, do not take your fathers, your brothers as allies, as awliya, if they have preferred disbelief over belief. So God here is commanding you not to even have a good relationship with your father or with your mother or with your brothers or with your sisters. So be socially and by family's terms, just excommunicated from that family because you changed from Islam. What? Why? Why are you ruining my mental status as well when it comes to my family? Why are you putting down my self-esteem in that case? When it comes to Jesus, he's not saying any of this. This is what he did say. I come as a sword to separate you from your mom and dad. Not the same as this. The sword that he is talking about is he himself. Why is he talking about he himself? Because if I believe in Jesus and I came from a Muslim family, my own brothers and sisters will be against me. If I am not a Christian and I'm an atheist, and now I become a Christian, my Christian values will trump the values of an atheist perhaps. My Christian feelings and thoughts and ways of acting will offend that person that is even my brother or my sister. Therefore, they will stop wanting to talk to me because I, in a way, am better than them spiritually. But not only that, they hate the person that I've become because I'm not living in sin as they were. This is the whole point. I'm not living in sin as they were. Therefore, I am separating myself just as a sword or a pair of scissors would cut open a piece of paper. That is the difference between chapter 9, verse 23 and chapter 3, verse 28 with what Jesus said about the sword. Do you have anything to add on this?
Well, I would say al-walah wal-barah is one of the most devastating concepts in Islam, because it's part of Muhammad's strategy to isolate his people from outside influences. It's one of the reasons why communities that are no-go zones have emerged all across Europe, because Muslims are encouraged to ghettoize, just as the Jews were when they were in Europe. It was a way to cut yourself off from interaction with other people, cut yourself off from the possibility of hearing other viewpoints that would enable you to have some critical thinking skills. It's a way to isolate the community in order to be able to control the community completely.
That's right.
And I think that, of course, in the case of the Jews, their ghettoization was often enforced by outside forces. People would make them live in ghettos. But that's not been the case in Muslim Europe. There they have chosen to create ghettos. And this comes out of this concept of love for the believers, love for Muslims, and enmity for the non-Muslims, that they are automatically bad people.
Yeah.
You should not associate with them. They will lead you astray. They will lead you into sin. They will, and if you think about it, this is just massive stereotyping. I love making friends with Muslims, and I surely do not stereotype all Muslims as terrorists or all Muslims as being like this or being like that. I've had hundreds of Muslim friends over the years, and I know some wonderful, kind, generous, helpful Muslim friends over the years. And it doesn't threaten me to associate with them, even though I've had several of them try to convert me to Islam.
Yeah.
And I had one experience not too long ago. I could tell you that maybe to end our time together, because it's a fun story to hear. But I feel that it's important for people to meet like this. And it's one of the reasons I encourage Christians and Muslims to meet together, because the idea of isolation is how you create extremism. The idea of isolationism is how you destroy critical thinking. Isolation is what keeps people from being able to say, no, your stereotypes are wrong. And so, I mean, one of the stereotypes I struggle with as a Christian in Bangladesh is, oh, you're a Christian. Oh, that means you're a pig-eating, wine-drinking, womanizing idolater. And that was just a deeply ingrained stereotype of what Christians were like. And my reaction is, you could only get that stereotype, first of all, by not knowing me, okay? And then primarily not knowing people in this society. So if Muslims want us to get to know them so that we don't foster these stereotypes, they also need to get to know us and not foster the same stereotypes, because stereotypes eventually lead to war as we demonize our enemies and as we seek ways to give excuses for our most intolerant thoughts. So al-walah wal-barah is one of the doctrines that really needs to be gotten rid of.
Right, and it's amazing that you mentioned the part of the ghettos. You know, the reason why Hitler was so successful is because he brainwashed the people, and then he dehumanized the Jewish people. So it's ironic that you even mentioned a Jew, and it's like poetic justice that Muhammad himself dies by the poisoned food of a Jew, a Jewish person, a Jewish woman. But when it comes to Hitler, back again, he dehumanized the Jews in order to make killing them so much easier, because they're not humans, they're just animals, they're filth, they're lower. And that's what we as Christians are in the Quran. We are najis, means unclean. He compares us to pigs and monkeys. He says that we are donkeys as well. He literally calls us donkeys. I mean, there are a lot of things that he does to dehumanize Christians and Jews. Therefore, when the murder of Christians and Jews, or when churches are being taken down in Belgium, this is completely normal. This is what we're supposed to do to dogs and to pigs, because they're filth, they're animals, and Muslims are the best of people, according to chapter 3, verse 110. And if you look at Tafsir ibn Kathir, the Muslim is supposed to have you as a Christian, Dr. Dave, bring you with a chain wrapped around your neck into submission so that you can believe. A chain wrapped around your neck. Who else does that? Cows. They get chains and ropes tied around their necks. Pigs, animals, filthy animals maybe do that when they're tilling the ground. So we are compared to animals, and filthy animals at that. But when it came to rejection, Islam changed, we see throughout history, from this spiritual move to a political move. And it was cloaked in religion, specifically a religion of peace. Not the case at all in chapter 47, verse 35. When you have reached the uppermost, when you are the uppermost, when you have the upper hand, you do not promote peace. You go against peace and into violence. Never should you call out for peace. Chapter 47, verse 35, because I'm really getting sick of Muslims telling me that Islam is the religion of peace. But let me tell you this. The belt is also called the zinar. It was an invention by Muslims. that they should put it on the Christians so that way they can be recognized in who they are, and they're pushed on the side of the road when they're walking. And the side of the road or the middle of the road, if you go to any Arabic place, specifically older Arabic place, I'm from Iraq, the middle of the road is the sewer line. So you push them towards the sewers because they're filth. Or the Star of David. We know that from a lot of Jewish movies or Holocaust movies. The Star of David is an invention by the Muslims to spot the Jew. It was an invention by the Nazis. Hitler himself says, "It's been our misfortune to have the wrong religion." What are you talking about, Hitler? Hitler complained to his pet architect, Albert Speer. Why did it have to be Christianity with its meekness and flabbiness? Islam was a religion of men, and a hygienic one too. I don't see a hygienic one, but anyways. The soldiers of Islam received a warrior's heaven, a real earthly paradise with houris, wine flowing. This, Hitler argued, was much more suited to the Germanic temperament than the Jewish filth and priestly twaddle of Christianity. I just quoted to you Hitler. He loved Islam. Why? Because it included getting rid of filth, Jews as filth. So in case we are blind to what Satan has done, Hitler loved Muslims, so much so that he had Muslim Nazi camps in his camp. He had Muslim Nazis in Hitler's camp. There was a time where the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the founder of Palestinian nationalism, met Hitler and Himmler in Berlin in 1941. And he asked the Nazis to guarantee that when the Wehrmacht drove the British from Palestine, Germany would establish an Arab regime to assist the removal of its Jews. Hitler replied to the Reich, would not intervene in the Mufti's kingdom other than to pursue their shared goal, and the shared goal is the annihilation of Jewry living in Arab space. He approved of that. He was for that. Do you see any Christian doing that? And if you do, that is not a true Christian. But when we see Muslims doing that, and Muslims saying that's not a true Muslim, yes, it is, because I'm basing it off your sources. Your sources are saying to get rid of the unbelievers. Your Quran is saying don't befriend them. Chapter 9, verse 29 is saying to kill them wherever you find them because of their disbelief, not because they're coming against you in war. So here we're going to give it to Dr. David, final 2 minutes, to tell us how or what a person should do in these scenarios and what's the solution for this.
Well, I don't think the solution is conflict from our side unless absolutely necessary. In my opinion, we are entering into an age when Muslims are questioning Islam as never before. And I think it should be our primary purpose to facilitate that questioning, to help them to recognize some of the things that just will never work in Islam, that cannot be but oppressive. In the same way that communism is oppression, and I think the Chinese people are gradually beginning to figure out that the Communist Party exists primarily for the Communist Party, not for the Chinese people. And you could say the same thing about the fascists. Our best bet is to keep those lines of communication open where we can honestly talk about these issues and even allow Muslims to try to convert us or to show us, the joys of Islam. If I could just finish with one quick story. I had a Muslim guy trying to convert me a short time ago. And, he went through the whole spiel of how wonderful Islam is. It's a religion of peace, and it's a religion of, he had this incredible testimony. He's a Western convert to Islam. And when he got done, he kind of looked at me out of the corner of his eye and he said, "So why didn't you convert to Islam?" Now, I could have given him 500,000 reasons why I'd never dream of becoming a Muslim, because I've been studying Islam for decades. And I would say I've gradually gained less and less interest in it as a religion the more I study it. But I would say the one thing that struck me was this guy isn't going to respond just to critique of Islam. He desperately needs to hear of something better. So at that point, I quoted to him Dawood Rahbar, who studied the Quran and tried to figure out if there was an Islamic theology that he could develop from the Quran. He'd noticed that Kalam, Islamic theology, had not written any books in 800 or 900 years. And the reason is simple: there's nothing to write. But he thought he could come up with an Islamic theology book after 900 years. And when he got done, he wrote a book entitled The God of Justice. And in that book, first of all, he discovered that as a Sufi, or a Sufi-influenced Muslim, he was a heretic, because Sufism says you can have the immanence of God, you can experience God in some sense. And the Quran and the Hadith all clearly teach God is not knowable. You cannot know him, you cannot experience him, you cannot have a personal relationship with him. And so the only thing he could see in Islam was that the God of Islam is a God of unmitigated justice. Keep the law, go to heaven. Break the law, go to hell. And there is absolutely no grace in that system. Anything that you make up as grace is some kind of an invention that comes from outside of Islam. That was the point at which he made that incredible statement: I cannot worship a God who does not understand human suffering. At that point, my Muslim friend said, well, what did Dawood Rahbar do? And I said, well, it's simple. He became a Christian. Because in Christianity, we have a God who not only knows about our suffering, he has viscerally experienced it on the historical reality of the cross. And he takes our suffering on himself and our sin, and he makes the death of the cross to be the very means of reconciliation, whereby human beings can come into a living relationship, knowing and experiencing God. And for once, I had a Muslim friend who was speechless, because this is the answer that Islam can never give. It is the core of the Christian gospel, and this is what we need to be sharing with Muslims.
Amen. But to add to that, Dr. David, in Sahih Muslim 2767, on the day of judgment, the Christian and the Jew will take the place of a Muslim who's on his way to hell. So even if you apply all these bad deeds, hey, a Christian or a Jew will take your place as a Muslim. Where's the justice in that? And that's a Sahih Muslim. So in Islam, we don't find a system of justice. We find a system of favoritism, and favoritism made up by a false prophet who is supposed to be having a prophecy, but we see none. We have zero witnesses to he himself as being a prophet, when we have plenty of witnesses for Jesus being a prophet, but not only being a prophet, being God incarnate. And even if we were to destroy all of the Bibles that are available today, even if we were to take them out of the internet, you will still find Jesus as God in external sources, in sources that don't even believe in Jesus as God, but they're historians. They have to write history according to truth. And we find that in Josephus' writings, Eusebius, Suetonius, we find it in a lot. Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger. Regardless, our time is fleeting. What we're saying is, look at your Muhammad, look at your Allah. He's not a God of justice. He's a God of favoritism. And he's a God who just wants you to do right, but notices that you cannot do right. Therefore, he will place a Christian or a Jew to be there in your stead. Not so, not the case, never going to happen. What we're saying is, we're begging and pleading with you. Please be critical. Think critically of your Quran, so that way you can see what other views are existing out there. But if you keep being suppressed, or if you are suppressed by other Muslims, even if you are in a Muslim family, try to study the Quran in a critical way, and then try to go to the gospel. All I'm asking you to do is read 2 chapters, John chapter 3, and then Romans chapter 8 of the Bible. And then you might come to a conclusion that's completely different from what the Quran has to tell you. Besides, if you don't, that will give you more ammunition for you to talk against Christianity or to debate against Christians. So we're asking you to think critically of your Quran, and also you can do the same thing with the Bible. But read John chapter 3 and Romans chapter 8. Just 2 chapters will take you no more than 10 minutes, maybe 15, and that's it. With that said, Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Jesus said that he will wipe away every tear from your eye on the day that you die because of your suffering on this earth. And you will suffer. That's a guarantee. The bottom line is, there's no way you can enter heaven without a personal savior, a person that has never sinned, even according to the Quran, chapter 19, verse 19 and verse 20. He will take your place because he can, because he was sinless, not a sinful person like Muhammad. In chapter 48, verse 2 and chapter 47, verse 19, he is praying for his sin to be forgiven. And lastly, I'll leave you off with this story or with this example. If you're driving down the road and you're completely out of battery as far as your phone is concerned, you're lost. You're looking for directions. There are two figures there. One is dead, one is alive. Who are you going to ask for directions? Obviously, the person who's alive. Well, Jesus is alive according to the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. And according to the hadiths, and according to every single person who is Muslim, Muhammad is dead. So why not ask a person who's alive, that is Jesus Christ, for directions, but not on the way you should live and that only, but on the afterlife as well. This has been another great episode. Thank you, Dr. David Cashin, for joining us of The Truth and Lies. Hopefully we'll have you again sometime soon. God bless you and have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for watching another great episode of The Truth and Lies. Thank you and God bless you.